When you look back on 1972, you'll remember this voice.
What is really best about America is its compassion. This is a good country.
But will you remember this one?
Americans want an end to callous neglect of our most agonizing domestic sicknesses, and they want an America on the side of compassion and human dignity. And I believe that there's still time to bring that about.
And this.
I can't believe we've won the whole thing.
And this.
I'm here to appear in court in Friday on the LeGros case, the lawsuit against McGraw-Hill and myself on the book Fake. And that's it. And beyond that, I really have no comment until I can get my voice back and my wits and have about 24 hours straight sleep.
Will you at least tell us, sir, what it is your intention?
Richard Nixon, John Lindsay, George McGovern, and Clifford Irving. An historic winner in 1972, and 3 losers. Elections come and go, but only once in a lifetime are we entertained by a scandal with the ingredients of the Irving, Hughes, McGraw-Hill, Swiss Bank, Nina von Pallant affair of January. None of the principals had much to say in public, especially Miss von Pallant, Irving's glamorous girlfriend.
It's been postponed till tomorrow.
How do you feel about that sort of a snafu?
Takes time, that's all.
In February, Americans witnessed another event with no historical precedent whatsoever. Henry Kissinger, the president's advisor for national security, chose these words to describe it at a congressional dinner party.
Our advance party will soon be leaving. It will be accompanied by B.B. Rebozo, who has the problem of getting his houseboat up the Yangtze River. We have already reached a compromise on the main course to be served at the first official dinner. It will be cottage cheese with soy sauce.
Almost everyone was awed by the prospect of this great adventure, except George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO.
I don't give him a plus on his adventure that he's setting forth on this week, which to me is tied to the election. I think that all he can hope for is get some kind of favorable publicity. That he's going to China and to Moscow as a man of peace. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think you change the Chinese attitude toward people. I think it's still a cruel dictatorship over there, and I don't think that the president's going to change it.
But on the morning of his departure, February 17th, the president addressed a crowd of officials and their families on the White House lawn.
What we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war. If we can make progress toward that goal on this trip, the world will be a much safer world, and the chance, particularly for all of those young children over there, to grow up in a world of peace will be infinitely greater. If there was a postscript that I hope might be written with regard to this trip, it would be the words on the plaque which was left on the moon by our first astronauts when they landed there. We came in peace for all mankind.
The historic trip to mainland China got good reception, both in diplomacy and on television. We watched Mrs. Nixon visit a commune, which included a school, a farm, and a clinic where acupuncture was being practiced on an elderly patient. And like tourists through the centuries, the Nixons journeyed out to see the Great Wall near Peking.
I think that you would have to conclude that this is a great wall, and that it had to be built by a great people. Any lives, of course, were lost building it, because there was no machinery or equipment at the time. It had to all be done by hand. But under the circumstances, it is a certain symbol of what China in the past has been and what China in the future can become.
Also on the agenda was a ballet portraying the struggle of the people against capitalist oppressors. On February 25th, there was a glittering banquet in the Great Hall of the People in Peking, where Zhou Enlai proposed a toast through his interpreter.
In the past few days, President Nixon met with Chairman Mao Zedong, and our two sides held a number of further talks in which we exchanged views on the normalization of relations between China and the United States and on other questions of concern to the two sides. There exists great difference of principle between our two sides. Through earnest and frank discussions, a clearer knowledge of each other's positions and stands has been gained. This has been beneficial to both sides.
The following day, the presidential party flew to Shanghai, where a joint communique was issued.
This magnificent banquet marks the end of our stay in the People's Republic of China.
今天这样一个宏伟的宴会，标志着我们访问中华人民共和国的结束。
We have been here a week.
我们到这里了1个礼拜。
This was the week that changed the world.
Despite that sweeping statement, most Democrats and Republicans found little to criticize. But Congressman John Ashbrook, conservative Republican, was an exception.
I am shocked and dismayed that President Nixon's decision to accept Communist China's central demand of the past 22 years, unilateral withdrawal of all U.S. forces from the Republic of China on Taiwan. This has apparently been done in the absence of any concessions whatsoever on the Communist side. Furthermore, for the first time in a policy statement concerning nationalist China, the United States has failed to reaffirm our commitment to protect the 15 million people on Taiwan from communist attack.
April 13th found the president in Canada on a 40-hour goodwill trip trying to mend economic fences.
While we do not have a wall between us, while we do have this great unguarded boundary, this does not mean that we are the same. It does not mean that we do not have differences, but it does mean that we have found a way to discuss our differences in a friendly way and without war. And this is the great lesson for all the world to see.
And on May 23rd, the President and Mrs. Nixon flew to Moscow for still another summit conference. Ron Ziegler, the presidential press secretary, described 2 areas of agreement.
It was agreed that today the United States and the USSR would sign agreements on cooperation in the field of environment as well as agreements in the field of public health and medical science. President Nixon and President Marconi will sign the agreement in the field of the environment. Secretary of State Rogers and the Minister of Health, Soviet Union, Petrovsky, will sign the agreement relating to public health and medical science.
Additional business, the kind that could not be assessed at once, was reported by Henry Kissinger.
What we attempted to do at the summit was to bring together negotiations that had been conducted on a broad front over a period of a year, and to see whether they could be formed into a pattern of U.S.-Soviet relationships rather than simply a series of individual actions. Secondly, and very importantly, we attempted to conclude the SALT negotiations, because we do believe that to put the central armaments of both sides for the first time under agreed restraint is an event that transcends in importance the technical significance of the individual restrictions that were placed on various weapon systems. That essentially what we had planned to do, what we had expected to achieve, was more or less achieved, give or take 10%.
In 1972, time was running out on Richard Nixon's promises of 4 years before to bring us peace with honor in Vietnam. In January, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird gave us a progress report.
I think it should be pointed out that the use of American air power is substantially down. As a matter of fact, it is down by over 67% what it was in the quarter immediately preceding President Nixon's inauguration as President of the United States.
Prior to his China trip, the President informed the nation dramatically of secret talks in Paris.
After consultation with Secretary of State Rogers, our ambassador in Saigon, our chief negotiator in Paris, with the full knowledge and approval of President Chu, I sent Dr. Kissinger to Paris as my personal representative on August 4th, 1969, 30 months ago, to begin these secret peace negotiations. Since that time, Dr. Kissinger has traveled to Paris 12 times on these secret missions.
The reason for secrecy was to facilitate a sweeping peace proposal formally offered to Hanoi 3 months earlier.
Within 6 months of an agreement, we shall withdraw all U.S. and Allied forces from South Vietnam. We shall exchange all prisoners of war. There shall be a ceasefire throughout Indochina. There shall be a new presidential election in South Vietnam. President Chu will announce the elements of this election. These include international supervision and an independent body to organize and run the election, representing all political forces in South Vietnam, including the National Liberation Front.
But the talks remained stalemated, and in the spring, Hanoi launched a major military drive. Just before his departure for Moscow, the President made another announcement.
There's only one way to stop the killing. That is, to keep the weapons of war out of the hands of the international outlaws of North Vietnam. In full coordination with the Republic of Vietnam, I have ordered the following measures, which are being implemented as I am speaking to you. All entrances to North Vietnamese ports will be mined to prevent access to these ports and North Vietnamese naval operations from these ports. United States forces have been directed to take appropriate measures within the internal and claimed territorial waters of North Vietnam to interdict the delivery of any supplies. Rail and all other communications will be cut off to the maximum extent possible. Air and naval strikes against military targets in North Vietnam will continue.
Throughout the summer, heavy bombing continued, including some raids in which the crews did not wait to be fired on first, a violation of the Pentagon's rules of war. The bombing missions, directed by Air Force General John Lavelle, became the subject of a Senate investigation in September. And according to Senator John Stennis, the picture was one of confusion.
They testified about the strikes, the briefings for those strikes. They both said that plans were made sometimes 2 days in advance, and the plans were made with expectations of being fired on. And former Lieutenant Groff's testimony and substance was that they would unload their bombs whether they met this hostile reaction or not. Lieutenant Moore's testimony was in substance that the strikes were planned in advance, that hostile action was expected, but that the intelligence officer said that if you do not meet the hostile reaction, you will not release your bombs. Now that is a brief substance of the testimony of each one of them. There's a difference in that testimony.
Also during September, the Paris talks finally reached what the President called a sensitive stage. There were headlines about a ceasefire, a coalition government to include the Viet Cong, an American withdrawal, and the immediate return of prisoners. On October 26th, Henry Kissinger announced that peace was at hand.
Most of the most difficult problems have been dealt with. That we have to say that both sides have approached this problem with a long-term point of view, with the attitude that we want to have not an armistice, but peace. And it is this attitude which will govern our actions despite occasional ups and downs, which are inevitable.
A major stumbling block was President Thieu's refusal to accept the terms, and Hanoi's deadline for signing just a week before election was not fulfilled. Sergeant Shriver voiced the bitter mood of many Americans who felt the credibility gap was widening one more time.
He dilly-dallied around for 4 years while 20,000 people were killed in Vietnam and hundreds of thousands wounded, and at the last minute, like Tom Thumb, he pulls out a plum and says, "Look what a bright boy am I." Listen here. The fact is, and we've said it for a long time, that the peace which has been, or let me say the ceasefire, because we do not have a peace. The prospect of a ceasefire, which is all that's there. It's not peace, it's just the prospect of a ceasefire. That could have been negotiated 4 years ago when Nixon first came to office.
But as Thanksgiving approached, negotiations continued optimistically at the highest levels. Busing was a big issue in 1972, but one that was never resolved. Ecology, welfare, crime, drugs, taxes, they were all with us. So was economy, or lack of it. In 1971, the President had set up a wage and price control board, with labor and business both represented. But in 1972, on March 22nd, labor resigned. Again, George Meany.
It is our duty now to report to the membership of the trade union movement and the American public that we have no hope for fairness, equity, or justice in the pay board. The board is not tripartite. It is not independent and autonomous. The pay board represents government control. It represents political and business interests.
Said the President.
When I announced our new economic policy on August 15 of last year, I said that fighting inflation must be everybody's job. Yesterday, George Meany walked off the job. The decision to walk out came after the ruling on the longshoremen's contract. While other American workers are being held to a 5.5% wage increase, the pay board ruled against a 20% wage increase for the longshoremen. Mr. Meany supported the increase. The pay board was right. Mr. Meany was wrong.
When the question arose of a rise in auto prices in September, Ralph Nader took the stand before a congressional hearing.
On the social balance sheet, which the automakers conveniently forget to include, they are all greatly in debt to the public for years of neglect in safety and pollution control. This debt, which has created profits of billions of dollars over the years, has been ignored by the companies as they seek to require the federal government to shoulder the blame for the price increases which they are now seeking. It's grossly unfair for the auto companies to ask consumers, whose wages are tightly controlled, to pay higher prices for features that the companies demonstrably could have and should have put into effect many years ago. Certainly their exuberant portrayal of their autos, using such terms as rugged, etc., in their promotions, would have led to the expectation by consumers that such features should have been installed.
Campaign financing was an issue of the year. So was limiting the national debt. The ceiling was fixed by Congress at $250 billion, but the ceiling proved to be elastic, prompting this from George McGovern.
In a full employment economy, public revenues should equal public expenditures, but largely because they did not even seek a full employment economy. Republican leadership since 1969 has now run up an accumulated deficit of $80 billion. That just happens to be 1/5 of the entire national debt accumulated ever since the days of George Washington. What do you think they would say about Democrats if we had that kind of a miserable record of fiscal and economic mismanagement?
As Christmas approached, Americans seemed to doubt that wages and prices would ever get together. 1972 seemed to have one unique pattern, the sudden disclosure of sensational secrets. Secret negotiations, agreements, and bombings all came to light. In March, we learned about a secret promise by a corporate giant, International Telephone and Telegraph, of a $400,000 gift to the city of San Diego, then a possible host for the Republican convention. In exchange, the government was supposed to give ITT relief in a complex antitrust action. Washington columnist Jack Anderson broke the story.
Here you had an ITT case settled, the biggest antitrust case in our time. It was settled simultaneously with not a bond offering, but a cash offering by the same ITT to the Republican convention. Now, if they don't understand that that's wrong, then something's wrong with the Senate. I hope they understand that's wrong.
The facts were contained in a confidential memo allegedly written by an ITT lobbyist, Mrs. Dita Beard, who collapsed under intense questioning and was rushed to a Denver hospital. Amid much confusion and corporate double talk, ITT fed that and many other memos into the paper shredder, and president of the company, Harold Janine, was summoned before a Senate subcommittee.
I have never seen the memorandum. I don't know anybody in our company that received it. I don't know whether it's genuine. I don't know whether she wrote it or what it represents. And I hope that she can testify as rapidly as possible to clear up these facts.
A key figure in the supposed deal was Richard Kleindienst, then awaiting confirmation of his appointment as Attorney General. John Mitchell, who had resigned the post in February, defended him.
Observing these hearings and having testified in them, I would point out that there is not one bit of evidence or reason why the Senate should not proceed with the confirmation of Mr. Kleindienst as the Attorney General of the United States. It is certainly in the public interest that it be done now and be done as rapidly as possible.
Kleindienst's appointment was confirmed. Dita Beard did not testify, and the whole affair was soon overshadowed by yet another scandal, which Republicans called a caper and Democrats called a conspiracy. On June 17th, 5 men with electronic bugging equipment were arrested in a pre-dawn raid in the Democratic National Committee offices in a Washington apartment building known as the Watergate. 2 more Republican aides were arrested shortly afterwards. Lawrence O'Brien, then DNC chairman, accused the top echelons of the Republican Party of espionage.
I would say that there must be the clearest evidence possible of gutter politics in this one single incident, which I consider to be extremely serious and going to the very heart of our political system. Clearly, there's an identification of this group with the committee to re-elect the president. That is certainly clear, and we don't have to go to court to make that determination.
An immediate suit was filed by Democrats, and rebuttal came from John Mitchell, by then chairman of the committee to re-elect the president.
The lawsuit filed today by the chairman of the Democratic National Committee represents another example of sheer demagoguery on the part of Mr. O'Brien. This committee did not authorize and does not condone the alleged actions of the 5 men apprehended Saturday morning. We abhor such activity. The Committee for the Re-election of the President is not legally, morally, or ethically accountable for actions taken by individuals without its knowledge and beyond the scope of its control. In light of the thorough investigation which is underway and the readiness of the U.S. Attorney to proceed as evidence is developed, the lawsuit filed by Mr. O'Brien cannot be regarded as anything other than a political stunt.
When the hearings began in October, the Washington Post gave the whole affair detailed coverage, eliciting this statement from Clark McGregor, Republican campaign chairman.
Using innuendo, third-person hearsay, unsubstantiated charges, anonymous sources, and huge scare headlines, the Post has maliciously sought to give the appearance of a direct connection between the White House and the Watergate, a charge which the Post knows and half a dozen investigations have found to be false. Unproven charges by McGovern aides or Senator Muskie about alleged campaign disruptions that occurred more than 6 months ago are invariably given treatment normally accorded declarations of war.
Senator McGovern made it a campaign issue, as did all Democrats.
The men who have collected millions in secret money, who have passed out special favors, who have ordered political sabotage, who have invaded our offices in the dead of night. All of these men work for Mr. Nixon. Most of them he hired himself, and their power comes from him alone. They act on his behalf. They accept his orders. Yet Mr. Nixon has even promoted some of the officials implicated in these scandals, and he has blocked any independent investigation. He refuses to answer questions either from the press or from the people. He stays hidden in the White House, hoping you will mistake silence for innocence.
At election time, a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was shaping up that promised some lively headlines in 1973. Meanwhile, Governor John Connally, chairman of the Democrats for Nixon, tried to bring reconciliation.
Jealous husbands and wives are bugging each other, and there are too many private detectives with too many strict, sophisticated surveillance equipment. Business associates and business concerns bug each other. There's too much bugging in political campaigns, and I don't condone any of it. I condemn it, and I think it ought to stop.
Another feature of 1972 was a spectacular hijacking series, a one-day strike of airline pilots, and high-level conferences on hijack prevention. Said General Benjamin Davis, Assistant Secretary of Transportation for Safety,
"We must instill in all parties, airport operators, airline management, and flight crews, an increasing determination to resist hijack and extortion demands to the fullest extent possible, consistent with the safety of any human lives that are involved." Too often, hijackers have been afforded service and responsiveness that's not provided even the first-class traveler.
Prisoners of war made news. On September 3rd, 3 rather confused POWs were released by Hanoi into the waiting arms of relatives and a peace committee. En route to Hanoi via Bangkok, Mrs. Minnie Lee Gartley was approached by newsmen about her son, Mark.
So, you know, you think, is this Wonderland? Is it all true? Or is it like Alice in Wonderland? And really not until we landed in Bangkok and I looked and my feet were on the ground and I realized I was here. I think for the first time I realized it is all true.
Shocker of the year was the horrifying drama at the Olympic Games in Munich in September, when a masked band of Arab terrorists entered the Israeli quarters of Olympic Village and gunned down 2 men, took 9 hostages, and fled to a nearby airport. All the hostages and 5 Arabs died in the shootout. The Games hung in the balance until President of the IOC, Avery Brundage, made this proclamation.
We declare today a day of mourning and will continue all the events 1 day later than originally scheduled.
If Indonesia and the Middle East were trouble spots, Bangladesh was not far behind. Early in the year, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, returning to his new nation from captivity, spoke defiantly.
You know all the history what has happened in Bengal. I think if Hitler could have been alive today, he could have been ashamed. I welcome foreign aid for all countries of the world to reintegrate my people. But it does not mean that anybody wants to impose something on us and will accept it. My millions of people have died, many can die, but I am not going to lose my freedom again anymore.
Throughout the year, Bangladesh teetered on the edge of famine and collapse. Sporadic but bloody fighting continued in Northern Ireland throughout the year. After a melee in Derry in which 13 people died, Jack Lynch, Prime Minister of Southern Ireland, spoke out.
We consider that it must be now clear to the British government that their policies in Northern Ireland are misguided. What is now required are the immediate withdrawal of British troops from Derry and Catholic ghettos elsewhere, and the cessation of harassment of the minority population, the end of internment without trial, a declaration of Britain's intention to achieve a final settlement of the Irish question, and a convocation of a conference for that purpose.
Brian Faulkner, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, replied,
"Today, when it is clear that a campaign to achieve a united Ireland without our consent is being mounted both by parties in Northern Ireland and by the government of Mr. Lynch, it is right that I should sound a most solemn note of warning. The Unionist community in Northern Ireland will not tolerate such a proposition."
And Edward Heath, British Prime Minister, tried very hard to achieve reconciliation.
There will be no let-up in the fight against terrorism. All the security forces will continue to have our full backing and support. I want to say a special word to those of you who live in Northern Ireland. You are the ones who have had to endure the years of violence and fear. We admire the steadiness and courage with which you have done this. Now, only you can take the decision to live together in peace.
But by the year's end, peace had not come to Ulster. At home, U.S. district attorneys failed to win their cases in two important trials. The Harrisburg Seven, including Father Philip Berrigan, were accused of conspiracy to kidnap officials, burn draft records, and commit acts of violence. But a jury found the seven guilty only of smuggling letters out of prison. Father Daniel Berrigan, brother of the defendant, commented,
"Both he and I can testify that from our own prison experience, hundreds of letters are passed every day of the week, drugs are passed, money is passed, and no indictments ever ensue. So both the tone and the content of this letter, it seems to me, highlight in a very alarming fashion the selective nature of the indictment."
Another of the group was Sister Elizabeth McAllister.
The rejoicing that is manifest among us at this point is something that does not hide our awareness of the shoddiness that we have seen in this courtroom through the whole process. It does point out the fact that a jury is often more just, even a hung jury, than either the judge or the Justice Department. And that shows us that perhaps the work before us is to put more and more authority into the hands of people. People frequently have a greater sense of decency than those in power. And they have a sense of refusal to buy the government's paranoia, particularly with regard to conspiracy.
On June 5th, Angela Davis was acquitted and immediately traveled to the Soviet Union on a triumphant tour. But while still in prison, she was allowed an interview with her minister, which was taped for broadcast.
A lot of people somehow have the feeling that the movement is collapsing. But I think that what is happening is that the ideas that a few people have been expressing for a long time are penetrating to the masses of people. And you have sisters and brothers who are, say, 5, 6 years old, who know of what has to be done.
During the year, death claimed the King of Denmark, the Duke of Windsor, Walter Winchell, Mahalia Jackson, Ezra Pound, Adam Clayton Powell, and Jackie Robinson, the first black player in Major League Baseball, and a respected community leader in recent years. The Reverend Jesse Jackson spoke at his funeral.
In this last dash, Jackie's soul hung. Pain, misery, and travail have lost. Jackie is saved. His enemies can leave him alone. His body will rest, but his spirit and his mind and his impact are perpetual and as are fixed to human progress, as are the stars in the heaven, the shine in the sun and the glow in the moon.
Another loss of 1972 was J. Edgar Hoover. One of his admirers commented,
"For 25 years, from the time I came to Washington as a freshman congressman, he's been one of my closest personal friends and advisors. And every American, in my opinion, owes J. Edgar Hoover a great debt for building the FBI into the finest law enforcement organization in the entire world. I have ordered that all the flags on government buildings be flown at half-mast. Edgar Hoover, because of his indomitable courage against sometimes very vicious attack, has made certain that the flag of the FBI will always fly high."
Like all elections, that of 1972 got off to an early start. But unlike some others, it was a crowded field for the Democrats. Surprise candidate was Shirley Chisholm, Congresswoman from Brooklyn.
"I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman and I'm equally proud of that. I stand here now without endorsement from many big-name politicians or celebrities or any other kind of prop. I am the candidate of the people of America.
Another contender was Senator Edward Muskie.
I shall enter each of the first 8 primaries in New Hampshire, Florida, Illinois, Wisconsin, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and as many of the others as my time and resources allow.
A major primary in 1972 was in Florida on March 14th, where the issues were busing, law and order, taxes, and party solidarity.
My dear friends, this is no new speech for Hubert Humphrey. I have not only been talking this way, I've been living this way. I've been fighting this way, and I need your help. On the day of March 14 now, I want you to back your champion. I have been your champion. Now stand up and fight with me and vote for me. Thank you.
That was Hubert Humphrey. John Lindsay also ran in Florida. So did Henry Jackson and George McGovern, who plugged for peace.
We would be in a position, once we've terminated hostilities by a withdrawal date of that kind, we'd be in a position then under the Geneva Agreements to take action even as extreme as very intense military action against North Vietnam. I personally think that's an academic question. I think we would unlock the negotiations if we would set a definite deadline.
Winner in Florida was George Wallace, who then barnstormed the country for 2 full months before finding himself in Laurel, Maryland, in a shopping center, where he spoke on one of his favorite themes.
And the people of both races in this country are fed up with the fact that if somebody gets knocked in the head when they walk away from this shopping center today, the person who gets knocked in the head, that knocks you in the head, is out of jail by some federal judge's edict before you get to the hospital. And on Monday they'll blame a policeman about the whole thing. They'll say he's to blame for it. But while you folks are working and paying the taxes and holding the country together, you've got to be able to walk the streets safely. And I want to tell you, thugs have taken over the streets of every large city in the United States, and I want you to send them a message through George Wallace that we want the streets again safe for the average citizen.
Within minutes, Wallace himself was gunned down by an assassin before crowds of horrified supporters. An FBI man made this statement.
The suspect's name is Arthur Herman Bremer, B-R-E-M-E-R. Last known address, 2433 West Michigan Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Date of birth, 8/21/1950.
As the year ended, Wallace was still in a wheelchair, paralyzed by the bullet wound in his spine. At the Democratic Convention in Miami, July 10th to 14th, the party's choice was introduced by Ted Kennedy, who flew down from Hyannis to speak, but refused to run.
America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. That prayer is our promise. And how fortunate we are, how fortunate is America to find that promise in the wise and skillful hands of our leader, the senator from South Dakota and the next president of the United States, George McGovern.
The convention was remarkable for its vocal minorities, blacks, young people, and women, all demanding to be heard and get a plank in the platform. Choice of the vice presidential candidate was the best kept, perhaps the only, secret.
And surely I did not expect to stand before you tonight as the Democratic nominee for Vice President of the United States. It is thus with deep humility in the face of the responsibility you've asked me to assume, and with profound gratitude to you, the delegates, and of course to Senator McGovern, that I accept your nomination.
The rise of Senator Thomas Eagleton of Missouri was sudden. So also was his fall, when newsmen learned more about his past than was known at the convention.
On 3 occasions in my life, I have voluntarily gone into hospitals
as a result of nervous exhaustion and fatigue.
Senator McGovern defended him at first.
I've watched him at very close range in the United States Senate for the last 4 years. As far as I'm concerned, there's no member of that Senate who is any sounder in mind, body, and spirit than Tom Eagleton.
But party pressure was strong, and another running mate was chosen, the wealthy but economy-minded Sergeant Shriver, who jumped into the fight with great enthusiasm.
Hamburger's gone up 25%. Instant coffee's up 20%. Hot dogs are up 15%. What's this? Chicken has gone up. What? Soup is up. I'll tell you something. Pretzels are up 12%. Bread is up. And what's worse, beer is up 22%.
2 weeks after the Democrats, the GOP held its convention, also in Miami, but without apparent surprises or discord. The vice president, too, was renominated.
I personally am delighted to be a part of the ticket. I think the president's programs in foreign policy and economic policy and the domestic areas have been extremely effective for the country. Delighted to see how the foreign policies have brought about a change, a diminution in world tensions. I intend to carry the president's record to the country in every state.
Another interpretation of the record of the past 4 years came from Ted Kennedy.
We know the record of this administration on every issue, and the 4 horsemen of ancient name bore the names of war and pestilence, famine and death. And now in the government of Richard Nixon, the 4 horsemen are riding again, and they bear the names of incompetence, favoritism, secrecy, and corruption.
Another feature of the 1972 election was organized labor's lack of participation. George Meany explained the reasons.
There is a division among the rank and file of our organization, and rather than try to solve that division at the top, we're giving them a job on which they can agree and let them do as they like on the presidential candidate. We're giving them a job to try to get Labor's friends back on Capitol Hill.
As the weeks went by, George McGovern attacked the administration on ever broader counts.
We are confronted, in short, with both a moral and a constitutional crisis of unprecedented dimensions. Ambitious men come and go, but a free society might never recover from a sustained assault on its most basic institutions. And one can only ask, if this has happened in 4 years, to what lengths would the same leadership go in another 4 years, once freed of the restraints of facing the people for re-election? We must remember that freedom lost is seldom restored.
The election of November 7th was called the greatest political victory in American history, and a beaming president acknowledged the landslide vote.
This, for me, is rather unusual. I've never known a national election when I would be able to go to bed earlier than tonight.
It seemed that history and 60% of the American voters approved of the policies and accomplishments of Richard Nixon. The promise of 4 more years dominated the closing months of the dramatic, crowded year, the 196th of our republic, the year that was 1972.